one more SEC game before we talk about Ohio State and Penn State, and that's South Carolina and Vanderbilt. I'm a little excited for this one because we haven't been able to give South Carolina a lot of love this year. They're an interesting team. They play good defense. They've got what we think is a quarterback who's hot and cold but has potential, and he's got the moxie to go out and get you a win. South Carolina and Vanderbilt, this is a game historically that has kind of been ugly. I remember a few years ago they opened up. There was a Thursday night opener, and it was a complete ugly game for a team in South Carolina that was actually really good that year. So let's talk about this. We've touched on Vanderbilt a couple of times this year. Unfortunately, it was in games where they played like an Alabama or a Georgia, and it went sort of how we expected it to go. But let's talk a little bit about South Carolina to this point. Had a week off after a big win at Tennessee. Tell me what you've seen this year and maybe what you've seen most recently in these games against Arkansas and Tennessee. I'll let you run with it.
Well, something we've kind of flagged in our own personal discussion with South Carolina is really there are 2 points here. One is they're absolutely playing Will Muschamp football, and at times it's been successful. I don't know that I've ever seen a team win a number of games where they're outgained. I mean, it's kind of crazy that they won the North Carolina State game and they won the Missouri game, and then they lose by 2 scores to Kentucky, and they outgained Kentucky. So the first 3 games of the season, the team with the most yardage lost, and that's just kind of bizarre. But a lot of what they are has to do with the fact that they really shorten the games because they don't play a ton of possessions. Muschamp runs the ball a lot. They like to run the clock down with the style of play. And also, they are very opportunistic on terms of turnovers and special teams plays. They generate a lot of big plays, which have led to points in their wins. They've kind of outlasted teams. North Carolina State was a good example of that. Tennessee was a very good example of it. And they're really hot and cold. Bentley in particular, and this is really the second point, is a guy that sometimes can play at an elite level and sometimes can leave you kind of scratching your head. And it's easy to say it's because he's a young player, but he's not that young anymore, and he's played a lot of football. I think it's due to the fact that he has a lot of arm talent, but he's just not overly accurate or consistent delivering the football. And a little bit of it is rhythm. And you saw things like the early part of the Tennessee game where I felt like he was really struggling, and then late in the game he started connecting on some stuff. But there's just so many games where you watch the highlights and he looks phenomenal. But if you watch the whole game, there's a lot of routine plays that he leaves on the board, and it's kind of frustrating. And it's really easy as a fan to sit there and watch it and go, okay, this is who you are. And, next week we're going to be great. And the end of the season, he's going to be really good, and we're turning it on. And you have that sort of ingrained optimism. And I think you hear that a lot from South Carolina fans because they feel like he's going to turn that corner. We've seen a lot of games from Bentley now, and I don't know that he's necessarily going to turn that corner. I think it's to some degree just kind of who he is. He's a gunslinger. He can make a lot of plays for you, but he can also kind of hurt you, frankly. And, it's funny to me that they win at Arkansas 48-22. And we've already talked about how weird that game was on a lot of levels, but he threw for 6.4 yards per attempt, only had 52% passing. And against Louisiana Tech, he had 8.4 yards per attempt, 22 completions on 35 throws, 63% completion percentage, 300 yards passing, and they win by 1 against Louisiana Tech. And how does that happen? And I think a lot of it is just the Will Muschamp factor. It's that style of play that they do where the boom factor, and they try to hit a lot of big plays. I mean, it's easy to say they play Neanderthal football and they're really slow. They're not, and they take a lot of shots, and they try to at times play really aggressively. But what happens is when you're trying to throw a lot of deep passes, sometimes you don't see it because he never has time to throw it. He doesn't, throws it out of bounds, and it just looks like a nothing play, and people just sort of forget about it. And in those games, their offense looks really, really slow and lethargic. And then you have other games like the Arkansas game where they actually hit a couple big plays, and all of a sudden, they look kind of explosive, even though really in a per play sense, they were a lot less effective. So South Carolina has been a weird sort of Jekyll and Hyde team all year. Probably the hardest team for me personally to get a grasp on because of that. And I don't ever really know week to week what they're going to look like when they come out of the tunnel.
I think you made a good point about it was hidden in what you were saying about how they take a lot of shots, but I think this also goes back to sort of you've got some theories on offenses that have to rely on being explosive because they can't drive the field consistently. Do you see a lot of that in this South Carolina offense where they have to exploit you on a shot play or a deep ball because they're not going to get 7 yards per play and march it down the field?
There's probably a lot to that. South Carolina has not run the ball well, really, in any game. They've been somewhere between 4 and 5 yards per carry, in that range, really between 4.3 and 4.85 yards per carry. Against Missouri, against La Tech, against Arkansas, against Tennessee. They couldn't run the ball like against A&M. That was a really close game and a loss. Couldn't run the ball like against Kentucky. So if you want to look back at it, how did they win games? Well, they win games when they can run the ball successfully. And I think that has a large part because when they can run the ball with some measure of success, they can be a little more consistent offensively. The Kentucky and A&M game where they ran for 0.8 yards per carry and 2.7 respectively, all of a sudden they have to open it up. And when you do that, is there potential for sort of an Arkansas result where you do have some big plays? Sure, because when you run that Penn State offense and you chunk the ball down the field and you got a big arm quarterback, you can make a highlight reel catch, but that those same plays have a higher probability of not generating anything and just being lost downs. And it's a little hard to say, a good analogy of it, but I think a little bit of it is to say, if you took a guy and you blindfolded him and you played pin the tail on the donkey, if you watched a flashback of that, I mean, you could watch highlights and you're going to see some guy is going to pin the tail on the donkey perfectly, man. This is the weirdest analogy I've ever drawn, but you can watch a highlight
Yeah.
of it and some people are going to look really good. The problem is if you back up and you watch every play and the tails go everywhere. So some days that game of pin the tail on the donkey turns out pretty well. Some days it doesn't pan out well. And it's not that one game he's in rhythm or one game is not. Frankly, it's just luck. There's no way to play pin the tail on the donkey better one way than another. It is a little bit blind luck. I think Bentley's a little bit of an inaccurate passer. And sometimes, those throws at the dartboard, again, maybe a better example, it's a blind throw at a dartboard. Sometimes he hits bullseyes. Sometimes he hits a couple bullseyes. Sometimes he doesn't hit the dartboard at all. And that's what they have to resort to when they can't run the ball. And the problem is most teams can always run the ball enough that you don't have to resort to that level. South Carolina has that problem. And in some games they have fallen to that level and they do have to start taking weird throws and weird opportunities. And that's how you get these really strange results. And I think that's really a concern because not only did Deebo Samuel was a big loss and he gave them the ability to have big spark plays and to extend drives and to have some generation for the offense. By far the biggest comparison would be Pro Throw. And he had a big game against South Carolina, as I remember. It was one of his big coming out games. And then he gets lost for the year. And then it all of a sudden, all the other inadequacies just kind of got exposed because they didn't have a way to generate offense on that important third down. South Carolina was already in that boat. And now, they had the injury to Rico Dowdle. And all of a sudden, and I think things become a lot worse. And now you become more reliant on Bentley. And instead of letting him do the standard plays, the outs and the simple posts, and to make the play that's there, you're asking him to try to invent something. It becomes a little bit more of a throw at the dartboard. And sometimes it pans out, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, but it makes it incredibly unpredictable.
So for those of you Vanderbilt and South Carolina fans who are not up on your obscure Alabama football trivia, that Pro Throw reference was Tyrone Pro Throw, 2005 season, who was everything to Alabama, and then offense just kind of went to nothing when he had that injury. And the Samuel thing is interesting to me because it fits in with what we're talking about, where he was so needed was probably more in the special teams game because he was giving them kick returns for touchdowns or giving them the ability to get a lot of field position without having to drive the field. And when you do that, you can kind of hedge against not having a great offense when you've got that kind of weapon. I think this is an interesting kind of comparison. We don't do a whole lot of like transitive property or comparison across conferences because it doesn't really work. And we are going to talk about the fact that Vanderbilt has lost 4 in a row and in pretty bold fashion. But how much does South Carolina remind you of a team that Vanderbilt's beaten this year in Kansas State?
It's an interesting question in that I think if you were to look at their really high-level statistical profiles, they're pretty similar. I think neither one of these teams has a lot of guys that really scare you. And just to be frank, I mean, South Carolina is in a tough spot. And, we said this a lot last year. You cannot misunderstand how much of an empty cupboard that Will Muschamp inherited at South Carolina. And I know Steve Spurrier did great things for this program. And we talked about that Alabama-South Carolina game. That was one of the reasons I remember. That was actually Steve Spurrier's second SEC game. It was one of his first big SEC games. And he did well for a while, recruited well. He had like the Clowney years, but what he left Muschamp in terms of skill position talent is really sad. I think personally, really South Carolina has been a lot more deficient on the edges defensively. Their perimeter guys and their corners, what Muschamp inherited was inexcusable. And we talked a lot about what Kenny Thrill, that Kenny Thrill game against South Carolina, in my opinion, was completely due to the fact that South Carolina had a couple injuries, and it just exposed how laughably bad the secondary depth had gotten. Kansas State is a team made up of junior college players, more or less. They don't recruit well at all, and they kind of have to piece it together every year. They're usually better later in the year than early because they have so many junior college players that come in every year. But they do that because they don't have any 4-year talent. And there's some similarities there. However, stylistically, I think they're pretty different because Kansas State is a running quarterback team right now, and they're a very much power run team, and they can't throw the ball vertically to save their life. South Carolina is, strangely for a Muschamp team, really predicated on vertical passing. They're not a very consistent short and intermediate passing game. And Bentley obviously is not an Ertz class dual threat runner. So I think that's kind of the big stylistic difference. In some ways, I actually think this is better for Vanderbilt, though, because Vanderbilt, their secondary has been pretty good this year, and they've been able to play pretty well and frustrate teams, despite the fact that, and this is a notable thing, they're giving up 122% of opponent rush averages. And so the fact that South Carolina, the way that they differ is that they try to throw the ball more and they try to be, spread it around a little more rather than just be absolutely so power oriented as Kansas State is with the quarterback run game. And when I say that, I mean, when you have a direct QB runs, it lets you use more blockers because you can use the running backs as lead blockers. And I mean like power run in the sense of, pulling guards and the actual like called play called a power run. The QB power, it's what Kansas State runs a lot. South Carolina doesn't run quite that same scheme, but I think that's probably better for Vanderbilt because I think they're a lot better off dealing with a team that throws in the air or the air a lot because Vanderbilt's pretty darn sound in the secondary. Where Vanderbilt's been struggling is that people can absolutely positively blow them off the football.
So we see the last 4 games that I mentioned for Vanderbilt. They started the season 3-0, had sort of statistically there were a lot of lies that were being told with their statistics, and we talked about that leading into the Alabama game, and it ended up how we expected. I didn't think they had a poor showing against Florida. The score is not really fair to illustrate exactly how close that game was. It was a 1-score game, and they couldn't score late, and Florida tacked on one at the end. But Shurmur showed that he's capable against a decent defense in that game. Then you had Georgia and Ole Miss, and I think Ole Miss, yes, bad football team, but some really bad matchups for that Vanderbilt secondary in that, they had huge NFL type wide receivers. Shea Patterson, had a game. I don't know that you have that with South Carolina. So there's no Lodge or Brown, great 6'3", 230-pound, 220-pound wide receiver that's going to wow at a combine. And there's no Shea Patterson, I don't think, for South Carolina in this game. So is that a situation, kind of what you're talking about, where it sort of plays into Vandy's hands, or is South Carolina good enough as a team that it won't matter that they don't have these star top line talent guys?
Honestly, I think South Carolina is good enough to do what they need to do to score in Vanderbilt. I don't think they're going to blow Vanderbilt out. I think right now with who South Carolina is, they just don't have the horsepower, on the offensive line. They don't have the skill position talent or the running backs um, to do what they need to do to just run roughshod over South Carolina the way over Vanderbilt, the way they have been able to do of late. But but they're still going to move it pretty well, and I think personally, uh, I think Vanderbilt will acquit themselves a little bit defensively, but you know, even looking back at that last game, because that Tennessee game, South Carolina did not move the ball very well until late in the game when Tennessee got tired. They still moved it some, and I'm trying to hedge from having to say this, so I'll just say it. I think Vanderbilt is really, really bad defensively, and I'm a little concerned with the way they've been playing things. Derek Mason really made this move to have a smaller, faster, more athletic defense. That was his big shift and what he considered to be his big genius move this season. And his concern was the fact that they've been kind of out athleted at times defensively, and he felt like he wanted to make sure that just because they didn't have the 4 and 5 star players everyone else did, that they couldn't get beaten on the perimeter. Where I think he missed is, if you can't stop the run and hold up at the line of scrimmage in the SEC, you really can't even attempt to win a football game. Because if in this conference you can't stop someone from running at a pretty high level, most teams aren't going to have to throw. And South Carolina may not be elite, but Vanderbilt, frankly, in my view, and we talked about, again, going into the Alabama game, they played really, really bad offenses, and they were holding them to less than their averages. Nothing's changed in that regard. So I think South Carolina isn't going to have to result to the throw in the dartboard method in this game. They should be able to run the ball pretty darn well. And if they can do that, and maybe to sort of preview to the model, they're expected to get 4.5 yards per carry. If they can get 4.5 yards per carry, they can run a comfortable offense. And the flip side, South Carolina's defense has been pretty solid. Vanderbilt's offense has been at times incredibly anemic. So I don't really see Vanderbilt being able to keep up.
Well, and I think this leads directly into our model. So what does the model tell us? And is there anything that stands out that's sort of like eye-catching, or is it all pretty standard, exactly what you expected?
I think it's all pretty standard. The model says, most of these statistics defensively they're pretty good defenses, right? South Carolina is pretty good against the rush, 91% of opponent averages, 95% of opponent averages against the pass. Vanderbilt's 92% of opponent averages against the pass. Probably not quite as good as they have been. They've fallen off a little bit. But a little bit of that was the fact that Ole Miss really skews the statistics based not only off the fact that they're a really good passing team and can exploit a lot of things, but they also throw the ball so much that it tends to override all the numbers, if that makes sense. When you have that many passes in one game, it drowns out a lot of other games. The whole issue here really is that Vanderbilt gives up 122% of opponent rush defenses, or opponent rushing averages defensively, and that is a killer in the SEC. It's the same thing that's been killing Tennessee. It's the same thing that's been killing Florida. Those teams can't really stop the run at a high level.
Explain what that means. Explain that for people that haven't watched our show very much. Explain what allowing 122% of opponent averages, kind of in context, what that means.
Well, what that means is, for the teams that Vanderbilt has played, so Middle Tennessee State, Kansas State, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, those teams average 4.9 yards per carry. And I say averages, I calculate the averages on a per team basis, not a per play basis for the statistic. Vanderbilt's allowing 6 yards per carry. And so the teams Vanderbilt faced all average about 122% of what they would have averaged in all the other games they faced. So Alabama, for instance, averaged a lot more than Alabama got against Fresno State and Colorado State. Kansas State averaged more than they did against their other opponents. Middle Tennessee State did it too, on down the line. So, however you do going into the game against your average opponents, Vanderbilt's worse than your average game is. You're going to have a better than average game against Vanderbilt. Whatever you average going in, you should expect to get about 122% of that against Vanderbilt. Very unusual in the SEC. Most of the time, your SEC games are your harder games. You do really, really well against your 4 cupcakes, or maybe your 3 cupcakes. You do well against 2 teams kind of randomly, and then you kind of get below average against the rest of the SEC teams, and you kind of struggle with a 4.5, 5 yard per carry game. Vanderbilt is not like that. They're giving up 6 yards per carry, and everybody's basically treating them like a cupcake in run defense. And that's just not a good thing. It makes them, and also, basically turns them into a cupcake game. Teams don't have to throw, and it makes it really, really hard to sustain yourself defensively when teams don't have to have balance to succeed.
So what's the model score, and go ahead and give us your gut score too.
Well, the model score for this is a little weird. It's actually 21-11. And I think that's probably pretty fair. I'm going to say it's probably more like my gut would be about 24-10. So right in line with that. Vanderbilt has a little bit with Shurmur that they get 1 or 2 drives a game. I don't think South Carolina is going to run away with it, but I think they're going to be able to pretty consistently move the ball, and they're going to get a few scores. And I kind of see this as being a game that maybe gets to like 24-3, and South Carolina just kind of goes into turtle mode, and maybe late in the game Vanderbilt gets a touchdown. Probably not a real exciting game to watch. But it's an important SEC game. It's going to be important for South Carolina in their season. South Carolina needs this win, but I think more importantly, probably for greater context, it's maybe the start of a downward trend if they're not already there for Vanderbilt. I mean, we talked about this early in the year, but if they can't win this game against South Carolina, and now they drop to 3-5. Suddenly, Western Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, they're all winnable games, but the odds of making a bowl start to fall out of favor a little bit. And I think a lot of the luster may come off of what I think was a little bit of unfair praise, honestly, for Derek Mason playing against a lot of depleted teams at the end of last year, and they're kind of returning back to the mean now.
I think your gut score was about where I was going to be, although I think it's happens a little differently. I'm going to say 24-13 South Carolina, but I think it's a 10-10 type game at the half, and Carolina sort of leans on them to finish out the game. Looking at this, I think Kyle Shurmur is a lot better quarterback in terms of just pure ability and experience than what they faced last game in Tennessee. But on the flip side, Vanderbilt's running game, even though Webb has gotten a lot of praise in the past, Vanderbilt's running game is nothing compared to facing John Kelly at Tennessee. So where you gain in quarterback, you lose in running back, and I think that's actually in a lot of ways a little tougher, because if you can't run the ball, it makes it that much harder to throw it. So, and I know this episode made it seem like we're really down on South Carolina, and that's not the case. I think we've got a couple of things. You touched on both of them. One, you had some injuries to some really key players, and you don't have the depth to sustain those injuries and still play at a really high level. But two, sort of like you talked about, South Carolina is still rebuilding. I mean, they still are kind of recovering from, just like you said, a depleted team. So we're not killing South Carolina. I think both of us feel like they're playing a little bit above their heads, and are playing sort of a greater than the sum of their parts sort of situation. So any other thoughts on Carolina and Vanderbilt before we move on?
Yeah, I think to end, I tend to get really critical sometimes, and I probably have to take a step back. And I tried to say this earlier. I expected South Carolina to look a lot more like Kentucky has, where they've lost some games they really shouldn't lose and gotten blown out. That's where I thought they would be based on the talent level. And they sort of, other than slipping up in the Kentucky game, I thought they've played really well. I mean, the Tennessee win was a big win. I think A&M's a really good team. They blew out Arkansas. They beat a pretty solid North Carolina State team that's coming on solid, really good at the end of the year here. So I honestly think South Carolina is ahead of schedule. I think you just have to understand and be patient with how bad the roster really had gotten. And, if they're able to pull this out in the rest of the year, and probably, beating Georgia and Clemson is going to be a really tall ask, but I don't think it's impossible. And, Georgia, Florida, and Clemson, they've got three opportunities here late in the year. And I think they are willing, not willing, but obviously willing, but able to pull off an upset in one of those games. And I think at this point you can't be disappointed with the season. And I think they're going to win. They're going to beat Wofford. They're going to make a bowl. It's going to be a successful season, I think. Um, but now I think there's a little more possibility to gain some real positives ending the year, get a little momentum into recruiting, and they can start to build things up to where they're a more solid team on both sides of the ball that they need to be in order to compete at a high level week in and week out.